What are your overall thoughts on the season so far for Indiana and how it's transpired? And I know the positiveness of it, but just in general, game by game, what are some of the things that you think stand out to you positively and negatively about this season so far?
I mean, it's a great question because, for a lot of teams, being 6-0, it wouldn't really be a big deal. Like, especially if your schedule is as easy as Indiana's has been to start the year. The issue is, though, when trying to find a lot of negatives for Indiana is the fact that they're 6-0 for the first time since 1967. We're
That's
not
crazy.
talking
Yep.
about a program that, like 9 out of the last, 10
Yep.
seasons, they start out 5-0, 6-0, whatever. I mean, it is just incredible what's going on in Indiana, especially considering the last 3 years of poor play that they've had. I know the 2019-2020 seasons, like people will say,
Mhm.
well, Indiana's been good recently. They can, it's possible, but still, Indiana football historically is just awful. The losing is
Yeah.
power before team in college football history. So
It's like Nebraska
definitely.
basketball. So
Absolutely. It's kind of funny how Indiana basketball and Nebraska football are similar, and Nebraska basketball and Indiana football are similar. That's
good.
wild.
It's like that
But
Spider-Man meme where we're just both pointing at each other. But
absolutely. But I do think that, to look at just, maybe I guess you would say some of the negatives, because obviously, like, the positives of the fact that Indiana's winning when they never have at this rate,
yeah.
is like you could say, their defense at times, like you said, the physicality. I agree. Like, the defensive line, it's not an elite defensive line. They have
Mhm.
one guy who's going to probably be an NFL player, Mikael Kamara. He's good. He has like 5 sacks on the season, but everybody else is just okay. They're not
Mhm.
great on run defense. I mean, they're not horrible, but they really haven't played anybody that's really pressured them in that regard either. Even though Nebraska is not the best running offense in the world either, but
Mhm.
still, maybe Nebraska will be able to expose that more so than some of the other teams that they've played. I mean, it's just tough to find a lot of negatives, though. I mean, they've
Yeah.
blown out everybody that they've played, basically. I mean, they're breaking records left and right. I mean, it was becoming like a meme online that every week Indiana was breaking some record.
Yeah.
So they're just doing so well overall. I mean, definitely the UCLA game was glorious. The fact Indiana got their first ever win in the Rose Bowl, that was awesome to see. I know UCLA is not very good, but actually Indiana has beaten UCLA by more points than any of the other teams that have played them. Penn State didn't even beat them by as much. LSU
Yep.
didn't beat them by as much. So I don't believe in the transitive property on that of how a team plays compared to others, but that is a good sign.
Yeah.
Just overall, like Indiana, when they've had some struggles, like Rourke threw 2 interceptions against Maryland, the only 2 picks that he's had all season. He bounced back from it, still threw for over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. So
Yeah.
every time Indiana, makes a mistake or two, they bounce back, turn it around, and their defense was not great against Northwestern, but their offense was fantastic. So just
Yeah.
seeing week by week, couple mistakes, couple areas they need to get better at, but then they just find ways to keep improving, and that's why they're 6-0, despite an easy schedule, but still impressive for Indiana.
Yeah, and I think that was my biggest thing that got me the kind of concerns or questions about the physicality too.
Mhm.
Not only that, but there is, because of the JMU transfers, of course, and so them being new to the Big Ten, and they've shown their ability to be physical against Maryland and Northwestern. But
Mhm.
kind of watching that Northwestern game, Northwestern kind of went blow for blow with them up until the end, and then they kind of ran out of gas. Do you think that was just kind of an aberration or an outlier on your defense between them and Maryland? Do you think there was just some mistakes that can easily be cleaned up, or is that kind of something that you think can be an issue against Nebraska? Do you think that defense is leaky to an extent, or do you think they'll lock it down?
I mean, it's kind of tough because obviously, I'm sure you probably do the same thing. But when you like a team and you're watching a game, you I wouldn't say make excuses, but when you watch stuff, like sometimes your bias kind of leans over. I really try not to have bias in that regard. I don't,
Yeah,
because some people are really bad, like they let their blinders affect their thinking big
yeah,
time. But
for sure.
that Maryland game, honestly, because I know most people besides Indiana fans and Maryland fans did not watch that game. There are a lot of other better games on, but Indiana should have won that game by a lot more than they did. There was one play literally, and it did show up on Twitter, but the defensive back for Indiana, D'Angelo Pons, who's one of the best defenders on the team, he got blocked accidentally by the referee, and he would have made a sure-handed tackle in the backfield, and it ended up being a 75-yard run for a touchdown for Maryland.
Yeah.
So that was probably the worst mistake Indiana's had all season long on a massive explosive play. Like, they have not given up explosive plays. A lot of it's been like short, like 10, 15, 5-yard completions and runs. Like, they haven't been like getting blown out over the top. But that run by Roman Hemby, 75-yard touchdown run, that looked bad on paper, like, man, Indiana gave up a big run like that. It was because the referee blocked D'Angelo Pons. And then there was another play in that game where I don't even know how this counted, but it was like 3rd 17. Maryland throws a pass, and the guy was like halfway out of bounds. He fell on his backside, and he was literally like half of himself was out of bounds, but they said that half of his body counted being inbounds. I don't know how that is, but they counted it. Even the commentators were like, that shouldn't have counted. And then Maryland scored a touchdown off like 3 guys tipping it up in the air, including an Indiana player, and then somehow it was caught. So, like, Indiana could have easily won like 49-14, but the game was a lot closer because of those 2 plays.
And what you're talking about, the officiating, I feel like officiating has just been, I don't know about you, but I feel like it's been horrible in college football this year, like terrible. It's just missed calls, more than I've ever seen. I don't know if any of it has to do with betting, but it's weird how much it's ramping up and getting worse. But with that being said, what are some of the things, when we talk about strength on strength, it's Nebraska's defense versus this Indiana offense. And I think Fongway's got a good point here. If the D sits back, plays that loose zone type stuff, the QB is going to pick them apart because Curtis Rourke loves to target that middle of the field. And the thing is, if you give them cushion, like, he's got the touch and he's got the ability to put the ball right where it needs to be. And that's what he's done so far this season. What are some of the things, because, looking at his numbers too, he throws, really well under pressure, just like he does with a clean pocket. But going against Nebraska's D-line and the defense that, allows, under 13 points per game, a rush defense has given up, no rushing touchdowns. What are some problems that you think our defense presents for Indiana's offense?
It's a great question. I mean, the thing with Indiana in the last 4 to 5 years, which is why Tom Allen ultimately ended up getting fired, was the fact that their offensive line was terrible, and Tom Allen would not fire the offensive line coach because he never fired anybody because, he was friends with everybody that was the coaches. That's fair. But the O-line was terrible. Indiana's offensive line is not bad this year. I wouldn't say it's like top 3 or 4 in the Big Ten, but they got a couple guys that might be draft picks. I mean, saying that for Indiana is unreal. Like, that don't happen, but very often. But the offensive line's a lot better. Indiana's running the ball very well. They got multiple running backs with tons of touchdowns. Their top 2 guys have like 5 rushing touchdowns, 4 rushing touchdowns, ranking very well in the Big Ten. And the reason, like you said, that Rourke has been able to have the season that he's had is because, he's making the throws, but he's had time to get rid of the ball. Yeah. So really, to be honest, Nebraska's probably by far the best defense that Indiana's going to face. I would have thought maybe it would have been Northwestern, but Northwestern's defense kind of was awful against Indiana. So I don't know if it's the case that Northwestern really hasn't played anybody that could expose their defense until Indiana. So definitely, I do think Nebraska, it's going to be interesting because they have the most talent of any team Indiana's played on defense. If they can get to Rourke and he is under pressure, he could make a lot of mistakes because he really hasn't been pressured to this point all that much. Because really, even the 2 interceptions he had against Maryland, it was actually wide receivers basically running the route wrong both times. You don't ever, like, Rourke didn't blame those guys. Signetti didn't blame those guys. Like, you don't do that. You own up to the mistakes and you go back out there and play good. That's how, you don't want to do that. But it wasn't really Rourke's fault. He's been basically perfect. But, I mean, those 2 picks weren't even really his fault. So 14 touchdowns, basically no errors. He's played fantastic, but he really hasn't been pressured to this point. So Indiana's offensive line is a lot better. But, again, they haven't really been pressured. So if Nebraska can get pressure on Rourke and Indiana's O-line and not allow them to run the ball, because that's something else Indiana's been able to do. They've been able to run the ball so much.
That was my next question. So we can lead into that. Like, what, we talk about the Indiana pass game. Give me some insight into the Indiana run game.
I mean, the thing I like about the run game is that a lot of teams have one guy. They have a main dominant back, and if he's not, like 100% healthy, you don't have any other options. Or,
Mhm.
if he's running out of gas, or just a type of back that he is. I mean,
Yeah.
like back in the day, like when you had Alabama with like an
Like a
Eddie
bell
Lacy,
cow.
who was just a Mack truck, but then they
Adrian
had Jay
Peterson.
Yeldon, who was the speedster. You
Yep.
had those two different options. Now, obviously, Indiana doesn't have either of guys that good, but they have different guys at running back. Really, they have a three-headed monster because Justice Ellison is really good. I mean, he's kind of a do-it-all back. He's got some power, but he's got speed as well. And then you got Tyson Lawton. He's the big guy. He's the big power back that just bruises for 3 or 4 yards like every single play. And then you got Kalen Black, who's kind of a little bit of both as well, has more of the power of Lawton, but still some speed like Ellison. And then Elijah Green, who they don't even play that much, he's the speedster. Like,
Yeah.
honestly, I don't know why he doesn't play more, because he's fast. When he gets out in the open field, he's really good, but they don't play him that much because I guess, the other guys they trust more or whatever. But still, like, Indiana has diversity at running back in their guys that they can use. Like during the Stevie Scott era, it was just Stevie Scott. Like, that was it.
Yeah.
Like, you had Peyton Ramsey, Michael Penix, and then it was Stevie Scott, and nobody really behind him that was able to really contribute all that much. Now they have multiple different guys that can, scare a defense, not super heavily, but good enough. And I really think the offensive line being better has contributed to their success. Because if it was the offensive line under Tom Allen the last couple of years, these guys wouldn't be doing anything. Even though I do think that they're upgrades at running back, because every single running back Indiana has, they're all transfers. They're all new. None of these guys were on last year's team. So the offensive line's contributing to it, but the running backs, I like their different styles of play that can confuse a defense.
For sure. And shout out Jackson. I just want to say shout out to you. Thank you so much for the $5, man. It's greatly appreciated. I appreciate everybody who even stops in, likes the stream, comments, super chats, man. I appreciate it. So thank you so much, Jackson. We really appreciate that. So now let's go a little bit into, I'm going to just kind of ask a general question here about who, in your opinion, is, it could be multiple players, but who, in your opinion, is the key for Indiana to win this game? Maybe like an under the radar. We know Curtis Rourke, but who are some other guys who you think are going to need to step up for Indiana to win this game?
It's a great question. You're talking about both offense and defense, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Absolutely. So, I mean, he's not an underrated guy, but Elijah Surratt has been incredible for Indiana. And I'm really surprised that he's not further up on draft boards. I don't know if it's because it's Indiana. Like, I feel like there's an Indiana effect where you're playing at Indiana, so you're not going to get recognition for the draft. But Elijah Surratt statistically has been one of the best receivers in the Big Ten. He's reliable. He doesn't drop balls. Ironically, Indiana's wide receiver room only has one drop among the whole team this season. One drop in 6 games as the whole unit. I don't even know how it's feasible. So Rourke's been on the money, but the receivers have been uber reliable. So that's another thing with that. But Elijah Surratt, he's just an all-around wide receiver. And the thing is you could say, well, yeah, Nebraska can shut him down, but Indiana's wide receiver room's deep. Keyshawn Williams, he's been emerging lately because Miles Price and Miles Cross are two kind of slot receivers who have been basically the main 2 guys for Indiana. But Keyshawn Williams has been coming around. He's another slot guy. They got like 3 different slot receivers, but Keyshawn Williams, the Wake Forest transfer, has gotten a whole lot more recognition in the last couple of weeks for his play. He had like a 50-yard reception where he caught like a little screen route, and then he was just running all over the place. Just a little guy, kind of like, I wouldn't say Whop Philyor level yet because he hasn't played as much, but he could get there. So he's good as well. Zach Horton at tight end is probably the most underrated player on the entire team because he only has like 90 receiving yards. So he's not getting any recognition because he's not catching a lot of balls, but his blocking is incredible. That's another reason that the run game's been so good. He's a fantastic run blocker. And then on defense, I mentioned Mikel Kamara, but he's going to be a guy everybody's going to pay attention to because he's one of the sack leaders in the Big Ten. But D'Angelo Pons definitely is key because Indiana secondary, I wouldn't say it's leaky, but they can get exposed at times. But Pons is only 5'9", but he's so good. I mean, he doesn't give up receptions hardly ever. even though he's going up against guys that are like 6'3", 6'4". Ty Felton for Maryland, who's been basically the best part of their team. He
He's
only had
Maryland.
30
He's their
receiving
like
yards
only
against
target.
Indiana.
Yeah, he's like their only target. Like he had a crazy amount of their percentage of overall production. Yeah.
He only had 30 receiving yards, though, against Indiana. And, like, in the other games besides that, he's been averaging, like, 100 receiving yards. So, definitely, D'Angelo Pons is a big reason for that. So, I would say D'Angelo Pons is key. And definitely Jalen Walker and Aiden Fisher at linebacker for Indiana as well, because they're probably the two best defenders on the team outside of Mikel Kamara, but they don't get as much attention because Mikel Kamara has the statistics to back it up. But those guys have definitely been good in the run defense as well.
Yeah, and David has a good question here that I was going to kind of go into. You know, that crowd, of course, is going to be raucous and probably more of an atmosphere than you've probably seen, you know, maybe in a long time, if not your lifetime. Now, how much of a factor do you think, and I know, because I know it can be a factor, but, you know, when Indiana and that stadium is rocking, like how much of a factor do you think it can be in the game?
It's a great question because, honestly, the only time I can remember Indiana's crowd being a key component to the game was that Cincinnati game in 2021. They were coming off the great season in 2020.
Yeah.
There were no fans because it was the pandemic year. And in 2021, they came into the season ranked, but Penix was not healthy. And that crowd did impact the game. Like, they definitely helped out the team stay in that game. And unfortunately, a very bad targeting call that they put on Micah McFadden ended any chance Indiana had to win in that game. He was doing everything on defense. But that crowd, though, was there in that game, and it was very loud. And I think Cincinnati, like Ritter, was definitely struggling a little bit at first, but then they came back, won the game. But this year, I mean, the crowd's been pretty awful this year. I'm not going to lie. A lot of Indiana fans don't like hearing that, but Kurt Cignetti's basically been like, I wouldn't say begging, but he's been like, come on, guys, like we're winning games here. You know, I'm here to build this team. You got to do your part. Because against Charlotte, Western Illinois, you know, teams like that, there was no crowd. It was weak. And obviously, you know, those are bad teams, but that's what people talk about with Nebraska. They have the best fans on earth because their team's been really bad for a while, and they still show up. They still sell out the crowd no matter who they're playing. It could be FCS team. They still sell it out. So Indiana's not at that point. But now that they're winning, and that Maryland game, it wasn't a sellout, but it was very close. It impacted Maryland. It was pretty loud. It's the loudest I've ever heard it on TV since that Cincinnati game. Now, this game's going to be sold out. So I think it's going to be comparable to that Cincinnati crowd back in 2021. And you can hear it on the TV. I mean, Indiana, when they're good and they have a reason to cheer, they're good. They're just not like Nebraska where they'll cheer whenever. Like whoever they're playing, maybe that will come with time if they keep winning and Cignetti stays. But since this is a big game, big noon kickoff, it's a sellout. And I know a lot of Nebraska fans have been trolling on Twitter like, oh, well, it's going to be half of us there, like at the Colorado game. I don't think so. I think it's going to be at least, like Will says right there, 70-30 IU. That's my opinion. I think 70-75% of it will be Indiana fans. It's not going to be like Colorado. I don't see it. Now, if it is, I think that will really be tough, but I don't see it.
There was a built-in incentive for us to take over Colorado Stadium, though, because they were actively trying to keep Nebraska fans from being able to buy tickets. So if you had a address in Nebraska, I don't think you could buy tickets from their website or something like that. And so Nebraska fans were going to get season tickets so they could, and then sold all the rest of them except for the Nebraska game, so that way they could get into the game. So yeah, they bring a little bit more incentive. But yeah, our fans do travel very well. But at the same time, you know, this is a situation where Indiana, as excited as they are, probably aren't selling a ton of tickets like out to other people. So that will be something to really watch too. It's not like, I don't know if we would even be able to tell. They're both red, so you know, it'd be hard.
Yeah, because Nebraska fans are saying that too. I love the Twitter debate back and forth about the crowd. Oh, well, we're all going to be red, so you're not going to be able to tell until.
I think that's a legitimate. I mean, that's a legitimate thing because I was just thinking that. I was just like, well, I'm not going to be able to tell the difference probably just with the TV being quick panning, you know, and stuff like that. Maybe if I was there, but not with the TV. As little as they show the crowd, I'm like, I don't even know if we'll be able to tell. Got to go by the noise probably.